Hi guys, welcome back to my channel Indoor Exotics, and today I'll be making another terrarium. I've got this stand with two quite small bottles and I've got the perfect idea in mind for them. So let's not waste any time and let's get right into it. Starting off with the terrarium on the right, I decided that it had to come off the stand as the metal support would stop me from being able to get things into the bottle. However, this came with another challenge. The curved underside of the bottle meant that I was unable to keep it upright, but I quickly found a small pot that held the flask comfortably while I was still able to see the interior. The first thing I needed to do was create a drainage layer. This prevents the substrate from becoming waterlogged and helps keep the ecosystem healthy. As you can see, I'm just using play sand, but you can use nearly anything. Once I had enough sand, I added a separator. I'm using window mesh due to the small size of this terrarium. I cut it to a rough size by first cutting around the base of the bottle and then trimming down some of the edges. I added it using tweezers and then used them to move it into place. I think you all know what I need to do next. Add the substrate. I powered it in using a spoon and then adjusted it using tweezers. Once I had enough, I began to flatten it down using tissue. And, as I'm trying to create a mossy cove, push the substrate up against the glass to build the sides up drastically. Due to the small size of these bottles, I decided to plant it before adding the rocks and wood. This should make it easier. Also, due to the size, I'll be sticking mainly to moss, but I'll also add a few other plants. To start, I awkwardly added a large piece of pillar moss and then moved it around to fill the left side. I then kept adding moss. All the moss I'm using is pieces that I found locally and quarantined. I kept adding it, filling in smaller pockets with small pieces until I had a scape that I liked. As you can see, my general idea is a sort of mossy gorge with a rocky vein through the centre. So, let's add the rock, and no, I don't mean Dwayne Johnson. To start, I'm adding 3 small river pebbles to create the main structure. The smooth sides look like they could have been worn down over time by a waterfall running through the terrarium, or at least I like to think that this is the effect it has. Now to fill the gaps between the moss and pebbles, I'm using some crushed up slate. Not only does this add variation, but also creates a nicer transition between the two mediums. I added it using tweezers. This took a very long time, but it helped me be more precise with my placement, which will make it look better in the end. I found this carries true in all my projects. Taking my time and taking breaks every now and again helps the finished project look much more complete and gives me time to think of new ideas in a build. I rarely have a set plan for the entire thing, and I like to go along as I'm making it. This way I can see what works and adapt to problems that might pop up. In this project at this point, I still had no idea what I wanted to do for the second bottle. I had a few ideas, but we'll get onto that soon. Moving on now, it's time to add another small plant, Ficus pumila quercefolia. I'm adding a small grouping to the right side of the moss. This plant is very easy because its roots very quickly find soil, so there's no need to plant it properly, which could damage a scape that is this small. The final thing I want to add is some twigs. These will really break up the monotony of the moss, and I think some icy twigs looping over the gorge will really bring it together. I also added some finer twigs near the foreground for some added texture. Whilst making these terrariums, I was constantly cleaning the inside of the glass with bent tweezers and a small microfiber cloth. Make sure to use microfiber and not tissue, because tissue has small fibres which rub off easily and are nearly impossible to remove once they're in. Using my imagination, I can almost see a waterfall cascading down the centre of the valley. I might add that in the thumbnail, even if it's only an imaginary waterfall. It's still there in my mind. Anyway, back to the build. I accidentally knocked off the ficus while placing wood, so I had to fix it. This sort of thing happens much more often than I usually show, especially in such tiny builds. At this point, I was happy with how it was looking, so before I knocked more stuff over, I added it back to the stand and moved on to the second bottle. The substrate setup was very similar to the previous bottle, so I won't be talking about it too much. Although I have found that a key ingredient that helps the terrarium do well from the get-go is a good substrate system. This helps the plants thrive, which keep it looking good. Like I mentioned earlier, I wasn't too certain what I wanted to do with it just yet, so I left it for a while, and when I came back, I knew what I wanted to achieve. I decided to go for a sort of rocky cliff, a direct opposite to the previous bottle, using more rock than moss. I think the matching materials in different styles should really look good next to each other. I added river pebbles on the side, leaving room for moss and smaller rocks. I would have liked to use some larger rocks, however it was impossible to manoeuvre them through the small opening. I proceeded to add some slate. It might not make a big difference, especially that most will be covered by moss, however it gives me a better sense of direction when planting the moss. And then of course it was time for the moss. I'm again using pillow moss, but this time I created a vein down the middle and along the border. Whilst researching and looking at ideas, I found many rocky cliffs and similar places have quite separate lines of rocks and plants, and so I tried to achieve this in this build, whilst also keeping it as natural as possible, well, as much as we can in a glass bottle. Some of the mosses have small red threads rising above the rest of it, adding tiny pops of colour and variation in height. Like before, I added smaller pieces of slate around to fill the gaps between rocks. The sharper edges also help achieve a rocky look. From my moss box, I pulled out this tiny sprout, so using the smallest tweezers I could find, I planted it in the moss. This should help create variation, breaking up the consistency of the moss. I added small ivy twigs in the mosses, pressing them in to make them seem like they'd been there for a long time, even though they haven't. And I finally finished it off with some Ficus pumila quercefolia. I added it back onto the stand, and with that, it's all complete. Well, that's all for this project. I'll keep you all updated on it. Let me know if there's anything you want me to do. I'm also planning on adding some new critters to my animal room, so consider subscribing to see when that happens. I'm a big fan of this terrarium, and it's one of my favourites. I can't wait to see how it grows. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.